Good debt versus bad debt. It is coming into another season of lowering interest rates. And so I think the entire narrative is going to change around the concept of debt. Historically, when interest rates are lower, people will tell you to use debt arbitrage, which means take the debt and do something with it to get a better return on it through your business. And as interest rates then increase, people get a bit more worried about doing that. They don't know if they can back their ability to do that given the cost of debt. But we work with business owners every week who are taking on debt or using debt in their business. And when bet on yourself in your business is typically good debt if you're going to get a return from it. To give you an example, we had a client who is in an industry where they go to people's places and they help with things at those houses. Now they have to get to those houses, and as they grow, they typically need more vehicles. They don't have the working capital or cash flow to buy those vehicles outright, and so then they use debt. This allows them to speed up an outcome that they are looking for in their business, i.e. hiring, doing more sales, and then increasing their profitability. Now, there's a cost of this debt as well. But this cost that we saw recently was around 12%. And you could say, well, that's a very high interest rate. And you would probably be right to think like that, because most of us think about interest rates when we think about mortgage debt and therefore what cheap debt is, and it's probably around that 3, 4, 5%, and then we think, okay, that's what debt should cost. But in business, as you probably know, your interest rates will be a lot higher than mortgage debt unless you're borrowing against your property. So this new vehicle was going to incur a cost of debt of close to 12%, 11.95, I believe. Now, the company who are lending the money, they want to get a return on that money, and they want to decrease the risk that it may not be paid. So then they may take security over that vehicle as well. And if you don't pay it back, they would then go and sell the vehicle and try and recover their debt that they have lent to you. But the cost of this debt on this vehicle over the course of the useful life of this asset isn't actually that high. And for them, they have a high margin product and service offering that will allow them to make the money back and increase their profitability compared to not taking on that debt for that vehicle. So you could argue, and probably should argue, that that is a good use of debt. Now, often where we see bad debt creeping in, if we stick to personal finances to start with to just make it easier and then compare that to business. Now, when people start using the likes of buy now, pay later, which they would argue is good debt because it's allowing them to chunk down their payments and help them budget better, and they will have rationale as to why that is. But that becomes very bad debt when you are buying things that you necessarily wouldn't have paid for, but you now will because the price has been broken down into different components or payment installments. So if you wouldn't have paid $300 for the shoes, do we really need them for 6 payments of $50 at a time? Now, it becomes really bad debt 3 weeks into the repayments, and you lose your job, or you have other costs that creep into your life in an emergency, and now you start to get behind on that buy now, pay later debt. And now we are in trouble because we can't meet the obligations, and then we start running into fees. So that's when you'd probably argue that it is bad debt. Now, this is similar to business, where people will take on more debt to extend the runway of their business, but the runway doesn't need to be extended, it needs to be fixed. What I mean by this is that all the time we see business owners who end up in debt to the IRD to start with. Is normally a really good warning sign that the business isn't operating profitably, and so then that is a form of bad debt. It's very easy to get IRD debt, and the rate of interest that they charge you on it can be quite cheap. The late payment penalties, well, compared to other forms of finance, the late payment penalties will be a killer, and they're not tax deductible. But that's often a sign that something is broken within the business. And simply putting it on an installment arrangement or thinking, okay, I'll pay that back over time, doesn't mean that you've addressed the true issue that's happening inside the business. So we need to fix that issue in order to be able to then get back on top of that debt. Now, also, then people will take on debt for extending the runway and not fixing the problem, and they may go and borrow from a third party or a party that's going to charge a very high interest rate. Now, a lot of businesses in New Zealand don't generate enough profit or margin in their good or service to be able to outrun the cost of this debt. So then we would argue that that is not a good use of debt and therefore is a form of bad debt. So hopefully what you're picking up from this is you're all going to come up with your own definition of good debt or bad debt, or is it good, is it bad? Typically, it's good when you're using it to generate a return and bring a future outcome forward because you're using somebody else's capital to do that. You've got to really understand business before blindly going into more debt and just taking a risk and hoping that it all plays out. But if you think about it, there are probably around 600,000 people in New Zealand right now that owe money to the IRD. When you start stripping out the under 16-year-olds that probably don't have any tax obligations, or maybe even under 15, that might take out 1 million of them. So, 600,000 out of 4 million people owe some form of debt to the IRD. I'm guessing that at 600,000, it recently was 500 and something thousand back in June 2024. It would have increased since then. The number has gone from about $4 billion of unpaid debt in 2020 to about roughly around $10 billion into 2025. So more people must owe more money as well. So, that is not a good form of debt to have because you're actually now having to catch up on past tax with your current profitability. So you've got to use your current profitability to pay your current tax and your past tax, and that is a form of debt and it is hard to get on top of. But by simply bolting on new debt into the business without understanding margins, and if you are going in the right direction and executing a strategy that requires debt, you can run yourself into trouble. So before taking on new forms of debt, always speak to your accountant and just get their opinion of whether they think that that is a good idea or not, or whether there's something else that you could be doing and a different form of finance that you could be accessing, because there are so many types of debt now that make it look really sexy, and often the debt dealers will call it things like it's funding for your business and you can access this funding, you might qualify for it, but the interest rates and the terms can be very impactful to your business, so you want to understand what you're signing up for.